Yeah. So, good evening, everybody. It's July 27th, 2021. It's 6 o'clock here. I feel like I'm a newscaster. It's 6 o'clock here in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and I am joined by the wonderful Dr. Stephanie Yuhl. And she is going to be speaking with us on, I believe the title is The Politics of Historic Preservation from Charleston to Cleveland. And she's going to be discussing that, which follows up with our Ohio Humanities grant funded project, which is our oral history project here at the Shaker Historical Society. And it is following the Village Garden Club here in Shaker Heights, Ohio. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. Yuhl. If you have any questions at all during the length of this talk, or if you are watching this after the fact, if you're watching a recording, please feel free to comment them in the post below or comment them in the chat section, and we will be reading them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Dr. Stephanie Yuhl.
Thank you so much, Allison. I want to thank you and Brianna and everybody at Shaker Historical for inviting me to be part of this. In particular, I want to thank my friend Mark Souther, who I think just asked to get admitted to this meeting, for asking me to be part of this conversation about local history projects. And in particular, for today, we're going to be talking about historic preservation. And what I thought I would do in speaking with Allison and Brianna about how I might be able to add to this conversation about local history projects and historical societies, and with a place like Shaker Heights that has such a very particular built environment, I thought it might be really interesting to talk about the politics of historic preservation. And for that reason, you could also substitute here the politics of urban planning, the politics of the planned garden city like Shaker. And I thought what I would do is I would use Charleston, South Carolina, where I've done a lot of my research, as a kind of case study to look at the ways in which personal politics informs choices that then in turn shape the built environment and in turn create all sorts of power dynamics in a community. So what I thought I would do is use Charleston as a case study to maybe bring up some questions that might be helpful for all of you in Shaker Heights. One of my images, there it is. So just a little bit about me first. My name's Stephanie, and I'm a professor of history at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Mass., which is a Jesuit school, much like John Carroll there in Cleveland. And I've done a lot of articles and work in public history. I'm a practicing public historian. I've done museum consulting. I'm running an oral history project right now for LGBTQ Central Massachusetts. And I just thought I'd share these two pieces. These are two books that I've written. One is a project on queer history in Central Massachusetts, and this idea of ground level, grassroots, community driven oral history and archive building projects. It's been really interesting. And the other is a book that I wrote years ago called A Golden Haze of Memory, The Making of Historic Charleston. And this book is really what I want to pull some work out of today, but I'm also happy to talk to you about oral history projects, queer history, local history projects, etc. So I just wanted to show you the cover of this book because this image here in particular, which is a painting by the artist Alice Ravenel U.G. Smith, called Sunday Morning at the Great House. She painted it in 1936, imagining a lost, quote unquote, world for her of the rice plantation South Carolina economy. And as you can see from the image, it's highly idealized, highly romanticized, black-white racial relations, very orderly, with white people on a hierarchy. We've got generations here, older generations looking down upon younger generations, a black nurse here looking at the enslavers and then her enslaved community. And the oaks, the Spanish moss, all protectively encompassing this really paternalistic, idealized view of the Low Country. Even in its colors, I mean, it's impressionistic and pinks and pastels, when we know as historians that the average enslaved person's clothing in the Low Country for this period would have been dark navy or dark grays and woolen, so nothing like this. So this idea of how do we see the past? How do we see the past? And how does sometimes the haze of our memory, our personal politics, shape what we see as valuable and who we invite to the table, who we silence, who we erase, etc. Now connect those questions with this idea of power and identity in the built environment. I just show you here an image that everyone recognizes, I'm sure. It's a picture of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. when you stroll down a place like the mall with the Lincoln Memorial, Washington Monument, and the Capitol, with all of the Smithsonian along its sides, you get a sense of the intentionality of this landscape, right? Classical architecture, all white materials for the most part, except for the recent Museum of African American History and Culture, and also the original castle, the Smithsonian Castle. You know when you're there that this space is doing work, right? The built environment here is doing the work of citizenship building. It's doing civic work about authority, the state, and politics. So we know that when we're in a place like Washington, D.C., we're aware of it. But what I'm curious about is what happens when the visitor is in a different kind of place, right? What happens when that visitor is in a place like Charleston, South Carolina, and walking along cobblestone streets, seeing these 18th century structures, wrought iron balconies, large piazzas? Are they bringing with them a sense of the intentionality of this landscape? And the reason the landscape is so intentional in a place like Charleston is because of historic preservation. And what I want to get at is the motivations of the intent that chose to save, quote unquote, these various buildings. Who is behind this work? Because when you get behind the work, then you become critical and you start to uncover some of the motivations, and you see some of the values that are enacted in the landscape. And then as you move through it, you're able to perhaps be more critical and not as passive in your consumption of the landscape. I would say the same thing for a place like Shaker Heights. I'm sure all of you know all about the Vans and the built community, the planned garden city that is Shaker Heights, much like Roland Park in Maryland on a different scale. And you know its history, and the history can be rather fraught, particularly around questions of racial covenants and class and religion and access and exclusivity. It's the same thing with the preserved environment. And so I think that these questions hold true. It's really good to get at the underlying power dynamics, the underlying forces that shape the worlds that we live in. So let me just say something before we get started. My relationship with Charleston is itself conflicted about this tension between what you consume on the surface and then what you know underneath to be the history. When I was in college, I dated a boy, fell in love with the boy, visited the boy at his hometown in Charleston, and immediately fell in love with the city. And even though my relationship with the boy didn't last much past a few more years, my relationship with Charleston did, because I thought it was such a beautiful place. I thought it was such an historic place. And then I started to take more history courses in college. And I realized my nostalgia, which is not even a nostalgia that I would personally have. I'm not Southern. I'm not a 19th century white Southerner. Why did this place speak to me as a 19-year-old girl from California? And I realized that I was being sort of manipulated by the politics of aesthetics into buying the narrative of the city. And then once I started reading more history, I thought, wait a minute, this place is way more complicated than it appears. And in fact, by not showing its complicated truths, it does a disservice not only to the past, but also to the present community, right? In terms of inclusion, exclusion, and power. So I want to spend a second before we get too deep into the history of the early preservation movement in Charleston to share with you this slide that was that I created with two colleagues. I want to give them credit, Susan Snyder and George Thomas at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where I have an associate faculty position. That really brings together the question of what is history and what is heritage and memory. Because historical societies often do the work of both, and there's tension in both, right? When you serve certain constituencies. So history, as we know, it's the study of the past, how something came to be. We take a look at all kinds of evidence. We vet that evidence. Historians work with certain criteria. We have rules, right? We look at multiple perspectives, as many sources as we can on a given topic. We vet them. In other words, we look for corroboration of certain positions or interpretations. We are comfortable with ambiguity. I have to say that's one thing I love about teaching at Holy Cross. Part of our Jesuit mission is to make our students comfortable with ambiguity, and I think that's really important in this particular political moment where we're so balkanized. How do we sit with the tensions and the discomforts instead of needing a clean sort of polarized notion of the past? Historians live in their heads, right? We think critically about things. We're analytical versus narrative. When I wrote mostly next to head, here's why I put mostly next to that. Because even though I'm a trained historian, it doesn't mean that I'm not also a subjective person who has certain tastes, certain of my own history that has helped to shape what I think is valuable and what isn't, right? So I just wanted to asterisk that a little bit. It's not that history is somehow perfectly objective, and it never was, and it never will be, but it's always in a state of constant revision. It's dynamic, and it really pays attention to the vast majority of sources available in order to write the most accurate and persuasive version of something. Now, heritage or historical memory is something very different, but this is really where most people get their history. It's inherited traditions and beliefs, right? It's our sense of how something just is, what we know, be it through our family history, our local town. You know something about Shaker Heights. Shaker Heights is X. Charleston is Y. It's normative. It feels natural to the person whose heritage it is. It isn't static. Usually these things come out through treasured objects and ideas about those objects. Sometimes you see this in sports. You might see it in religious paraphernalia someone might wear. There are values attached to these different artifacts and to these different ideas of the past. And why heritage is difficult and should not be confused with history is because heritage is the group, really the group values of sort of one group trying to stand in for the whole. So what it ends up doing is it ends up flattening history, right? It ends up flattening it and saying, well, the Confederate flag means this because my people, whoever your people are, it means this to it. And in fact, it means multiple things, right? And it also functions in the present, that it does political work. And this is one of the reasons why finally so many communities have redesigned their flags or moved Confederate flags out of active spaces of governance into historic spaces where they can be contextualized as heritage as opposed to history. So what heritage does is it creates a single story of something, and that's not good history usually. It comes from the gut, it comes from the heart, and there's a lot of certainty about it. I just want to take a second and use a quick example from the recent news in Cleveland itself. Let me see if I can get this moving. And talk about your baseball team just very briefly, right? Just last week, or a week and a half ago, the Cleveland Indians changed their name to the Cleveland Guardians. And I'm sure that this was a very contested conversation in town. I would love to hear more about it in the Q&A if you'd like to talk about it. History changes and heritage can change too, but it's about being open to the multiplicity of voices in it. And it's about having a value-driven kind of mission for your historical society, your historic project, or for, in this case, the baseball team. And I just loved this Twitter. I don't know if everybody can see it. I've got, it was a Twitter from Tom Withers from the AP, a tweet saying it was right there the whole time. You know, this whole question of who are we and what should the team be named and all this back and forth. And there it was, there's the Guardian on the bridge, right? For this new age in Cleveland. So history and heritage is something that every community over time across geography struggles with, because heritage is usually writing people out of certain claims to authority and belonging, whereas history tries to write people into that. So I want to shift with those kind of frameworks in mind and talk a little bit about Charleston, South Carolina. This is the city seal of the city of Charleston. You see a berobed woman. She's holding out a laurel leaf and a spear, and you see the 18th century city in the background with a few church spires. And this is the city seal since 1783. And it says on it, she guards her buildings, laws, and customs, right? So from the beginning, Charleston founding fathers and the powers that be were very aware of their landscape and the built environment as something that's connected to customs and to law. And so when you have customs and law, you have power, right? You have some people in control, some people being regulated, other people doing the regulation. So Charleston is at once a beautiful landscape. There's no doubt. Aesthetically, it is beautiful. There's all sorts of incredible architecture there. But Charleston is also many things. It's also this image of the sacristy of Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston during the remembrance ceremonies for the 9 congregants and their pastor who were murdered in 2015. So Charleston is both and. How are you able to be both this and that at the same time? How are all of these people able to have a claim to the city? Today, Charleston works really hard on that. Historically, however, this was not really the value. And my point is that the physical landscape of Charleston, the built environment in Charleston, was shaped by certain kinds of values of elite white women in particular and later men. And those values persist in the tourism landscape of the city. And my argument is if those continue to persist, if Charleston is really a place made by preservation, not so much preserved, and if it has written people out of citizenship and participation, then it really can't be a place of social justice. And historically, that's been the case. And again, today, preservationists in the city, to their credit, are working really hard to be more inclusive and to recognize this history. This is Susan Frost, the image I showed you before. This is Susan Frost. She is a descendant of elite white Charlestonians. She was a very interesting woman. She's the founder of the first preservation group in Charleston, which was called the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings. Now, you might think somebody interested in preservation as Susan Frost would be a reactionary, thoroughly nostalgic, backward-looking person. And again, in terms of ambiguities, what's interesting about Susan Frost is she wasn't just that. She was that, but she was also a thoroughly new woman. Susan Frost was a single woman. She was a realtor. She opened a business on the main thoroughfare in Charleston with all the male businesses in the 1910s. She was one of the first, I believe, the first woman to drive her own car down Broad Street in Charleston. She was also the first president of the Charleston Equal Suffrage League, which was a radical suffrage organization in the 1910s in America. So she's really a new woman in some ways, but she's also a very traditional woman. And the reason she's a traditional woman is in part, I would say, because of her personal politics, her family, the weight of her family heritage. She lived in her family home here, which is the Miles Bruton Pringle House. She loved this house. She lived there with her other unmarried sister, who's pictured here. They would give tours to paying guests who came to Charleston to soak up this colonial heritage of the city. Interestingly, the Miles Bruton House was both the headquarters for the occupying American Revolutionary Army and the Union Army. So you know it was a big, impressive building. Occupying forces always take the big properties. So she was very much modern thinking in some ways, but also very, very guarded about Charleston's past, understanding that past in particular through the lens of her family. And this is why I say the personal politics of preservation. It is her personal family story, her inherited stories, her heritage that shapes her belief in her city and in what is valuable and therefore what ends up getting preserved. One of the places that Sue Frost, even before she founded the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings, one of the places that she focused on was a street called Trad Street. And Trad Street was an historic sort of merchant space as well as residential street. One of her colonial ancestors, a man named Jacob Mott, who was a colonial treasurer, actually lived at number 62, I believe it was, Trad Street. And so she turned to this street in the late 19-teens because it had fallen into what she saw as blighted conditions. And what that means is, and Charleston was a very poor city, right? It did not have a lot of industry. Columbia in the north part of South Carolina was doing much better after the Civil War for various reasons. Charleston was sort of left to its own after the siege of the Civil War. And so there wasn't a lot of capital and there wasn't a lot of industrial activity. And many of the young male, white male heirs of these aristocratic families had to go north to work elsewhere. And so many of the properties fell into disrepair. And in that era, what that disrepair is in a way code for Black occupied. So many of these properties on Trad Street became Black occupied. And that just really bothered Sue Frost because she saw it, as her friend said, through a golden haze of memory, the title of my book, and wanted to bring it back to some imagined glory day of her ancestors. And so she turned to Trad Street to bring it back, as she said, to where it was for so many years before my knowledge. So she admits that it's even before she had any knowledge of Trad Street, but that's the real Trad Street, not the reality of the present in this multiracial space, but rather as an elite space of the slavocracy of Charleston, right? With white owners, and if there are African Americans around, they would be in outbuildings or they would be as enslaved persons. So she had this notion that the best people lived there. I want to bring it back to when the best people lived there. And of course, what that does is that writes off the current people that live there as impossibly able to be the best people, writing them out of a claim to being Charlestonians and a claim to being citizens through this kind of reimagined idea of historic preservation. Now, ironically, in bringing about the preservation of Trad Street, this is one of the preserved homes, Susan Frost relied on the incredible artisanal skills of an African-American artisan named Thomas Mayhem Pinckney. And he helped her reclaim several of the Trad properties. Now, this is early gentrification, right? This is early gentrification that is targeted at taking properties, turning them over, removing the current residents who are seen by the renovator as undesirable, and bringing new capital and new residents in. And that's exactly what happened for Trad Street. More elite whites moved in, including some artists, and that's one of the spaces of the beginnings of gentrification in Charleston. But the real movement began in 1920. In April of 1920, at the home of the Pringles, you'll hear that name quite a lot, on the Battery. This is their beautiful home. Susan Frost called for a meeting. She called for a meeting to defend the built environment in Charleston against the onslaught of modernity. In particular, they were focused on this, they were focused on this home, which is the Manigault House. This is, let me go backwards, excuse me. This is Nell McCall Pringle. Nell McCall Pringle and her husband owned this home where the meeting for the first gathering of the Society for the Preservation of Dwellings was held. And she was a romantic. She was married to a banker, an elite banker who himself was the descendant of the slave-owning classes in Charleston. And she very much cared for not just these buildings, but what she imagined these planter homes symbolized as a kind of golden age in Charleston, South Carolina. And so when the call went out to the 29 people who were present, by the way, I believe 26 of whom were women. It was a very gendered movement, very much women driven, as a lot of this early philanthropic preservation or garden club that Shaker Heights case study served to show. These women, they passed the hat and they committed that they would use their own funds to help buy this building, which is the Manigault House, the Joseph Manigault House in Charleston, South Carolina, which at the time in 1920 was being threatened with desecration, according to the preservationists' language, by not only the placement of a gas station, which is interesting because, again, it's a car, which is the symbol of modernity. But again, remember, Sue Frost used cars to take her real estate clients around town and drove them herself. So selective. A car is okay this way, but not if it's going to threaten our heritage. The other thing about the Manigault House in this period is that the tenants were African American. It had turned into, from a single family house, into a 3-story tenement home. And this, according to the people gathered at the Pringles house in 1920, was an absolute travesty. And the goal was to bring this building back to some imagined former glory. Now, the building itself is quite remarkable. It's Adams-style architecture. There are some incredible features, including this stairway. And what's interesting about this stairway is that I found in my research a short story written by Nell Pringle, who owned the house. Eventually, all the people who said they would donate, they didn't quite bring enough money. So Nell and her husband, Ernest, who had 6 children between them, decided that they would put up the tens of thousands of dollars necessary to buy the house, with the understanding that the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings would pay them back. That never happened. It ruined Nell's health. It ruined their financial security. You've got to remember, just 9 years later, there's the stock market crash and her husband loses his job as a banker. So this house becomes a real burden to the family. Despite that, Nell Pringle sees this home as the repository of love and family drama and gentility and the Cavalier South. And she writes the short story talking about the staircase in particular and how a bride walks down it to meet her groom and to walk through the doors into a life of happiness. So there's a deep romanticization of these properties that is very much fueling why they get targeted as opposed to other properties for preservation. Again, the personal politics, the family associations, and the emotions. here's a picture of a moment in Nell Pringle's life that was quite sad, where she ended up having to sell part of the garden of the Manigault house. There's the house in the background, and here's the gatehouse, to the Standard Oil Company for a gas station. This felt like the ultimate loss, because you'll remember that they targeted the Manigault house because in part of a gas station being built near the property. So this felt like a failure for her, and in particular, the fears that the gatehouse would be ruined. The gatehouse was actually the bathroom for the gas station. So again, we have this juxtaposition of the old and the new, of modernity, and this impulse toward a selective nostalgia of the place. The Manigault house, in the end, city taxes, the need for repairs. Ernest and Nell Pringle dug deep into their pockets. They liquidated their bank stock. I mean, it was a grave, grave burden. And that's one of the reasons they actually ended up selling part of the property for this gas station. Finally, 13 years later, an anonymous patron stepped in and actually saved the bankrupt property from the auction block, and ended up donating it to the Charleston Museum. Now, this was a remarkable moment. And again, ironically, it's saved by a woman who's known, Henrietta Pulitzer Hartford Pignatelli, and she was actually a South Carolina native, but she was also the widow and heir to the great Hartford A&P and shock absorber fame and fortune. So modernity funding preservation. And again, there's that tension in there. So the Pringles really suffered personally for their personal associations with this property, and the way that property spoke to them of an era of pre-Civil War colonial Charleston, which of course would have been characterized by racial hierarchy, order, power, right, for elite white people. Now, the Society for the Preservation of Dwellings spent 13 years trying to save the Manigault house. By this point in the early 1930s, Charleston itself has changed. So Charleston has become a site for tourism, historic tourism in particular, in part because of the historic landscape of the preservation movement. And because money is now coming into play with things, more men are getting involved in the movement. This is a very classic kind of trajectory of the preservation movement. It often starts with women coming out of this domestic structure space. Remember, they called themselves the preservation of old dwellings, the home, right? Very much a feminine gendered space for these women. Once tourism starts making money, men step in. And that's the same is true with the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings. Susan Frost steps aside as the leader, and what the movement does is they turn, in this case, to the Judge Thomas Hayward house on Church Street, which was in the late 20s was a bakery, and they ended up saving it. This is literally a space where George Washington slept, and signers of the Declaration of Independence. And so there's a sense of this is part of the heritage. But again, it's just the heritage of one part of Charleston, right? I mean, George Washington, of course, the father of our country, et cetera, but also an enslaver. Were so many enslaved people in Charleston when this building was functioning. And Charleston itself was a Black majority city until 1920. So where is that history? It's being effaced. It's literally being whitewashed through the preservation movement and the writing out of different people's stories. One way the story of Black Charleston gets written in part, is by the neighbor of the Hayward Washington house, which was known as Cabbage Row locally, and became in the novel Porgy, which was the basis for the opera Porgy and Bess, the 1925 novel Porgy, became known as Catfish Row. So some of you may be familiar with that. This is an image of Catfish Row from the 20s, and here's an image of Catfish Row today as a bookshop and tourist site. So it's this sort of gentrification, cleaning up of things, quote unquote. In the 1920s and 30s, this was a site, was a Black tenement, right? It was a Black tenement. It was just a few doors down from the Hayward Washington house. So again, it's about getting buildings and the Preservation Society moving the current residents, predominantly Black, out of them in order to gentrify them and to bring Northern capital in particular to the city. A lot of Charleston's preservation is going to be fueled by Northerners, white Northerners who are coming to Charleston in the decades between the World War, and they see in this space a kind of projection of an identity, which is exactly what Sue Frost wanted, which is This is a genteel America. This is an America without stripes. This is an America of racial order. This is an America where white supremacy reigns. Here's another example. This is East Bay Street in 1900, and then on the bottom in 1920. In 1931, Dorothy Pochet Legg purchased the buildings with her husband and redid them. They had been former 18th century merchant buildings. Again, they were largely Black tenements and working class tenements, and even brothels. In fact, Cabbage Row, there was a sense that that had a history as a brothel that served many of the sailors that came to Charleston, cleaning them up and painting them in these colors, which are not historical, by the way, but rather speak to a kind of pristinization or pastelling of Charleston. And if you look at this image of Rainbow Row, I hope that you can think back to that image I showed you of Sunday morning at the Great House, right? Again, pastelling it. What does it mean to render a community that was a working community based on chattel slavery? What does it mean to render it in pastels, right? Just aesthetically, the politics of those aesthetic choices. So by this point in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Charleston has declared itself America's most historic city. They are really actively churning out a tourism industry that is trying to attract northern investment, northern property buyers. Lots of the old elite white families are selling their homes because they have no money. They're selling their homes to folks like the Guggenheims, for example, of New York. They're selling their homes to the Brother Seltzer King from Cincinnati. People who are coming to Charleston to, as I say, play planter, to have a kind of vicarious association, a compensatory association with gentility and elite white Americanness. But of course, we know that elite white Americanness is predicated upon a system of slavery that has very little play in this narrative, except in a really pernicious way where the volumes that elite white Charlestonians are printing during this period, they talk about slavery as the good times, right? The good old days, and that there was racial harmony among people. Now, you don't get a much more selective historical heritage than that. I do want to go back to this for a second and talk about these two men, because here's where the power dynamic shifts and men start coming into and taking over the preservation movement and professionalizing the movement. On the left here, you see Albert Simmons, Charleston-born trained architect. On the right, you see Thomas Stoney, who was for many years the mayor of Charleston in the 20s and into the early 1930s. Together, they pushed for a survey of the city that resulted in the first historic zoning ordinance of an old and historic district, 23 blocks in any American city. So while there are preservation moments in the United States, the Mount Vernon, the Ladies Memorial Association for saving George Washington's home, this is the first larger scale regulated historic zone using ordinances, using legal instruments of regulation. And that regulation is going to be really important. And Albert Simmons in particular is going to be a very important person for shaping the aesthetic of Charleston. In fact, Charles Hosmer, who's a major historian of historic preservation, once wrote something to the effect that the way Charleston looks south of Calhoun and in that historic district of the Battery area is largely the result of Albert Simmons' taste. So there are historic value to some of these properties, but it's largely driven by taste. And that taste in turn is driven by personal and family associations. I want to take one more example of how change happens, and under the guise of preservation and gentrification, a city that was a city of great juxtaposition becomes gentrified and flattened, right? It becomes flattened. And this is a story which happens in a lot of American cities, particularly during the Depression, when local economies are struggling, they're looking to get federal funding. This is a story of Albert Simmons and Thomas Stoney, and later the mayor, who then becomes Senator Burnett Maybank, seeking out federal funds to clean up, quote unquote, certain areas of the city that are too close to the historic district where Northern capital and tourists are coming. And they're poor districts, they're poor areas. And this area here was called Cromwell Alley, colloquially called Crumble Alley. It didn't mean just, Preservation Charleston didn't mean just the structural renovations of old houses where whites and elite whites and poor blacks had lived, like Tradd Street, but also black neighborhoods. Cromwell Alley was a long-standing black neighborhood in Charleston. By the time 1930s rolled around, there was a black church there. And with federal funds, this neighborhood gets targeted for urban reclamation along racial lines. This becomes an intentional strategy buttressed by federal dollars. And with federal funds brought in by Maybank and Simmons, because again, men and using their male networks in Washington, D.C. to bring money down to the city, they destroyed Cromwell Alley, moved this building, which had been a black orphanage, kept the building rather, but moved the orphanage way, way, way north. The city gave the orphanage, the black orphanage, some money to get those kids out of the historic district. And this was, it's still in the area, this was the old city jail and workhouse, which was a notorious torture house during the times of slavery in the city. And they built, with federal money, lots of federal money, what's known as the Robert Mills Manor. And why this is interesting, it looks like any other federal project, public housing project, but this project, following Jim Crow lines, was only available, these homes would be only available to white residents. And the black residents who were pushed out of this neighborhood by federal and local dollars were given a federal funded public housing project, but it was far up on what's called the Charleston Neck. Charleston's a peninsula. It was far, far away from the eyes of elite white locals, of property owners, and of tourists. So it's a real form of cleansing, as it were. I do want to quote a remarkable woman named Mamie Garvin Fields, who wrote a book called Lemon Swamp and Other Stories, if anyone's interested. She was an elite black woman. She descended from free people of color in Charleston. And she described the housing arrangements in Charleston this way. Days gone by, black and white people lived uptown and they lived downtown. The black families among the white families and vice versa. But once these federal dollars came in, once preservation happened, that all changed, right? So the irony of Charleston and the irony of the historic preservation movement is that the preservation movement was supposed to be preserving history. The historic landscape of Charleston was a racially integrated space. Doesn't mean it was politically integrated or socially integrated, but it was residentially integrated. And what preservation did is it created a whitewashed, ahistorical Charleston that in turn packaged as historic in order to lure tourist dollars and lure capital from other white people for whom that elite white antebellum colonial allure resonated. I do want to say another quote from Mamie Garvin Fields, because she's amazing. She said, during the early 20th century, the tumble down parts of Charleston just got more tumble down, but there was work across the aisle. And then with federal funds, et cetera, and too much money, and Charleston backing an all-white kind of vision of itself, Black Charleston, who's written out of that idea of who gets to be Charleston, gets pushed out. This is one of the last things I want to talk about, and it's an historic survey in 1941 of Charleston, an architectural survey. What the powers that be felt, the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings, and later renamed the Preservation Society of Charleston, felt is that the historic district was too small. In other words, historic preservation and historic zoning was really successful in Charleston, and now they wanted a bigger one. They wanted a bigger district, more regulation, more exclusionary practices. And that's exactly what they got. They were able to expand. The historic district. And this was one of the works that was arguing for why that should happen. And how this took place, this architectural survey in 1941, is that various people, Alice Smith, the painter who painted the painting that's on the cover of my book, Albert Simmons, his cousin, Samuel Gilliard Stoney, and others got in a car and literally drove around, and they filled out little note cards. A woman named Helen McCormick filled out note cards saying whether this building was valuable or not, right? Was it valuable? And many of the times, the reason it was seen as valuable because of very personal associations. I just want to read this to you. That even though the desire was for this to be very professional architectural survey, really many of the historical and sentimental values of buildings are the reasons why they were noted as valuable and worthy to be saved. So Helen McCormick, who worked for the Carolina Art Association, the Charleston Museum, she said that she would go on drives with Alice Smith, and Alice Smith would drive her in her car with her chauffeur. Alice did not drive a car, her chauffeur drove, her black chauffeur. And we would drive around, and she pointed out things that she remembered that she thought were important, right? So it's literally Alice Smith saying, yes, this person lived there in the 1780s, and he's important because this person was my cousin, and that was their home. As Simmons later explained about part of this process, he said, no Charlestonian can be expected to speak or write about this city objectively, for it is so much a part of the background of his mind and emotions that detachment is never possible. That's the main architect of historic preservation in Charleston in the later years, Albert Simmons. Albert Simmons, who also leads the Board of Architectural Review, which, and this will be familiar to those of you in Shaker Heights, which regulates all exterior changes, approves and disapproves any exterior changes to buildings in the historic district. Albert Simmons had remarkable control over the aesthetic vision of the city, as did Alice Smith and Sue Pringle Frost and Sam Stoney and others. So I want to kind of end there, because what I want to do is say two things. One, we need to not take the built environment as a given, as something static, but rather something constructed by people whose sense of history may be a sense of more of heritage, more personal than actual historic. I want to also underscore the fact that today in Charleston, the city is trying very hard, as you can see here from one of their recent slogans, Charleston, keeping it real. Charleston, in some ways, is a victim of its own success. Charleston has had remarkable, unprecedented growth. People want to buy into the Charleston mystique, the mystique that I would argue is grounded in the preservation choices of the 1920s and 1930s. As a result, prices have skyrocketed. Locals cannot afford to live in the downtown area. Workers that work in the downtown area, many of whom are African American, cannot afford to park in the downtown area. So the city has a shuttle from way up north on the neck to bring folks down to serve the tourist economy in the hotels, in the restaurants, etc. I think that's a real disservice and an injustice to locals. So what does it mean to stand up for Charleston, right? What does it mean to stand up for any city? And I thought I would end with this slide, because I want to think about this idea that floats around in urban planning circles around the right to the city, that everyone has a right to the city. And it shouldn't just be people who can afford things in the city, that there should be, cities are places of juxtaposition, they're places of contrast, they're not places of homogeneity and simplicity. So what is it that makes a city like Charleston resilient, sustainable, inclusive, and livable? Those are the values of the current Preservation Society of Charleston. I absolutely applaud them. They have absolutely expanded their view past the early views, the very narrow, early, elite white views of their founders, the Society for the Preservation of Dwellings. They are trying to do work that is inclusive. And I wonder if it's too late. In some ways, it's brought about by climate change. There's major flooding issues in Charleston. In other ways, it's brought about by racial trauma. Black Lives Matter movement, the murders at the Mother Emanuel Church in 2015, and other kinds of racial violence in the area. So I want to applaud people in Charleston who are doing this kind of work. But I also want to ask you, what would make Shaker Heights reliant, sustainable, inclusive, and livable, right? And I want to end, as I often do, with one of my heroes, who's James Baldwin, and a comment he made about the nature of history, because I think it speaks to my talk title today about the personal politics that are preservation, how we should not just take things for granted as a given, but rather as a construct. And he says, history is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It can scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And that, to me, is local history in a nutshell, oral history projects in a nutshell, and certainly the politics of preservation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Yuhl. That was a very powerful discussion, and I really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us on that. And I found a lot of similarities between Charleston and Cleveland, as your title promised, and I feel as though there's a lot of similarities, especially with the gentrification that has happened over the years, and then the preservation. Currently, Shaker is going through something very similar, where a very hot button issue right now is the Upper Lake, the Horseshoe Lake Park. There's a Shaker made dam there that was constructed in sometime in the 1800s. I should probably know the day or the year at least. And that dam has now failed. And the professionals are now telling us to get rid of that dam. And there is pushback from the community, but it was never there in the beginning. So I found that to be a very hyper local kind of maybe tie to what you were talking about, but more, I think something else to think about is also the Clark Lee Freeway that potentially would have destroyed and split up Shaker Heights, that didn't go through Shaker Heights, but went through African-American neighborhoods down the line. So there's definitely some historical mirroring that has happened across our cities. I really appreciate you spending the time to, put this together for us and share your expertise and your knowledge with us. I found it to be very powerful for myself. So if anybody else has any other questions or comments or any burning questions that you have for Dr. Yuhl, I'm just going to, again, thank you again for spending your time with us tonight and sharing your expertise. I found this to be a very powerful thing, just for me at least. It's great.
I want to thank you, because I know you called and asked me to be part of this. And again, I want to thank Mark Souther for recommending me. And I remember saying, because of my knowledge I have of Shaker Heights, I thought, are you sure? Because I'm pretty critical of the bands. I'd be pretty critical of the aesthetic choices and the things that we see as beautiful. Beauty is political, right? That it's taste, and it's not universal. And when we make claims to universality, we are inherently excluding, right? And so I just want to thank you for being willing to have me here as a critic, who, again, and that's why I started with the story of me being ambivalent, right? I even got married in Charleston. I joke that I have a love-hate relationship with the place, and I think that that's healthy, though. That history is messy, communities are hard. We're a heterogeneous place. How do we make that real, right? In particular, when you think about Shaker's relationship to Cleveland and its intentional distance relationship with the building of the railroad, et cetera, historic relationship. So I'm just grateful that you were willing to let me ask these questions about what is valuable and who gets a voice at the table.
I definitely think that these conversations need to be happening more frequently and at greater lengths with people who are in positions of power currently, and even with the communities, to give everybody a seat at the table, because it's our collective history, right? It's everybody's collective history, and when there's only a few voices being heard, then that's when you get into sticky situations.
And that's why it's really important. I will say this: grad students at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, where I'm lucky enough to teach a few times a semester, and they do such amazing work at getting at the underlying forces that create a space. We might live in a space and think it just exists. It's just sort of happens, but it's not that way. Spaces are made. And I think that it's not even just who gets a place at the table now, but what is the history of the making of a place?
Mm-hmm.
And how did the choices of the makers of a place shape the place and its possibilities, but also its limitations?
Yeah.
And it's about citizenship in the end, right? And justice. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, and as Dr. Souther just posted in the chat, he says, thanks so much, Stephanie. Just an observation. Interesting. Shaker Heights was constructed as an all-white planned community, as it was a garden city. It was part of the Garden City movement, which if anybody is listening in from this one, you missed Dr. Souther's post. It is going to be posted on our YouTube here very shortly. Just had a couple editing things with that, but it was planned as an all-white community, except for, the servants who worked in the houses and worked for those homes and families. But it eventually became an intentionally integrated community, in contrast to Charleston, which was a deeply biracial and later became more exclusionary.
Absolutely. It's a kind of inversion mark, right? It's very interesting. And I would say that the kind of intentionality of Shaker in the 70s to think about its history and to think about what it wants to be. Again, that a city is an evolving thing, not a static thing, is to be complimented and commended. Whereas I do think Charleston is playing catch up. I think Charleston was chasing the money. I think Charleston also was delighted by shared values of gentrification and rising property values and a certain view of history that served white interests. And I think now they're trying to play catch up. Now, again, to their credit, they're trying to play catch up. But at this point, property values are such and the burden of history is such that I think it is unlikely. And instead, the work will be done in sporadic bits to try to correct the story with an historic plaque here or a particular neighborhood being preserved here that might have, like the Morris neighborhood that was an historically Black neighborhood. But the reality is most tourists don't go to those places, right? The tourists are still in that central original historic district for the most part. So even if you try to amend the narrative and try to be more inclusive, are people getting that? Are they getting the history? Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, it's definitely it's the whole thing with heritage, right? When you even talked about it, it's heritage and history and how that is interpreted in a public space with the interpretation that is brought to light, and whether it's, you know, quote unquote popular for, you know, visitors and stuff like that. It's much more convenient to avoid tough topics, right? And it's much more convenient for the tourist industry to avoid the horrors that have happened and, you know, the tragedies that have occurred, rather than, you know, look at these pretty buildings, look at these pretty things. And it's a much more convenient history to tell. So
sure.
it's definitely
yeah,
exactly.
For some people, you're totally written out of that history. I mean, it's so it really does come down to power, right? And I think it comes down to power, I think it comes down to justice, I think it comes down to the definition of democracy. And what better time than to be having these conversations than right now when our country is so tenuous in terms of our understanding of a collective, right? It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting when you do your oral histories with the Garden Club about what kinds of questions get asked, because the ladies of the Garden Club are very similar to my preservation ladies in Charleston and bring with them a certain kind of aesthetic, which, while beautiful to many people, isn't necessarily universal so, but rather speaks to other kinds of values and associations perhaps. So how do you navigate that in a local history project? I think it's a real challenge, and I wish you luck with it. I think it'll be really interesting to see what you, and I will say just for myself with the LGBTQ oral history project we've done here in Worcester, Massachusetts, which again is about sort of reclaiming marginalized voices, creating a platform for a community to tell its own history. But we were really intentional about allowing for tensions within the community, not creating a kind of, oh, all queer people get along and it's all happy. And then instead we found all sorts of instances of racism, of sexism, of trans sexism, right? I mean, there's all sorts of, because people are people, and power is a real thing. So I think the more complicated you can write a history and allow for the humanity of the participants, the better. So
I agree. And with that, I feel like if anybody has any other last burning questions or anything like that, I think we're going to close this up and end for the night. But again, I want to thank you, Dr. Stephanie Yuhl, for your time and for your expertise and sharing this with us. It was just, I personally did get a lot out of it, and I really appreciate you sharing this with us. And I hope that we continue to stay in touch after this project is over. So thank you.
And good luck with the Garden Club project.
Yes, thank you. And with that, I'm going to end it for tonight, but thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their evening.
Take care.
Bye-bye.